Hi everybody, and welcome back for Psych 230. This chapter, or the two chapters we're going to cover this time, are chapters 11 and 12, and so we're going to be focusing on the shift into adolescence. So we can get that to work. There we go. So our student learning outcomes are listed here, but generally we're going to talk about the physical, the cognitive, and the socio-emotional changes into adolescence. So we'll start with physical. With physical, we know our adolescents often are not getting the proper nutrition, exercise, or sleep, but still they're generally pretty healthy. So the leading causes of death are not, there's chronic illnesses yet, still more things like illness and injury. Or things like injury rather than illness. Adolescents do face a lot of challenges, though, in their physical lives, and so they're experiencing a lot of biological changes. Typically, what we're talking about with biological changes in adolescence is puberty. So it's a fun time of life that all of us remember. It's this transition from childhood to adulthood, and we have a lot going on at this stage. So we have hormonal changes, our body's changing with growth spurts, we've reached sexual maturity. And so for sexual maturity, we're talking about a couple different things. We have primary sex characteristics, and those are the genitals or the organs. So we'll see differences in the vagina and the penis and, the testicles and things like that, the actual organs. And the secondary changes are other changes in the body that we see, like breast growth and body hair. We also see something very exciting at this time. So this is the onset of menstruation or menarche. And so girls will experience this onset during adolescence. For boys, they experience spermarche, which is the first spontaneous ejaculation. However, we know a lot more about menarche than we do about spermarche. Boys don't really seem to share much about their spermarche. The timing of puberty, we've seen this average age of menarche, so for girls, decline since the mid-19th century. So it used to be around 17 years or so when we started menstrual cycles. Now many people are more like 12 or so. We think this has to do a lot with different factors. So things like genetic, environment. So a lot of girls have a bigger body size than they used to. They're better, have better nutrition. And then, strangely enough, there's been other findings. One is family relationships make a difference. So specifically for girls who don't have a father in their lives, they're often more likely to start menarche earlier. And what scientists believe is that the girl's body is kind of saying there's an absence of good men here. So we don't have a lot of good men available. And so if a good man shows up, I need to be able to reproduce quickly in order to maintain this bloodline because there's not a lot of men available who are good and who will stay. That's one hypothesis, but we do see at least that relation pretty strongly between not having a father figure in the home and starting menarche early. So the timing of menarche, or for pubertal changes, if you think about the boy, so if we've got this picture of this lovely gentleman here, if we think this guy is maybe 13, you can think about how he'd feel about his body if this is how he looked at 13. He's probably getting a lot of attention. Many times the boys will like this. However, if we see a young girl and maybe she's 13 and she's developing and she maybe has breasts or, starting to show some of those secondary characteristics, she'll get a lot of attention and many times will not like that. So for girls, the ones who start early, they often report feeling uncomfortable with these changes. They don't like being the one that people are noticing. Boys really report liking it, but it's also can be a troublesome thing for them. So if this young man is 13, he looks like he's 17, maybe a 17-year-old girl is saying, hey, come to my house, we're going to hang out. He's engaging in early sex. He's hanging out with peers who are maybe more delinquent. And so it can put him at a risk trajectory, looking as old as he does here. So he's not ready for it. Even though he might feel like, oh yeah, this is the best, he's not ready for that type of behavior. So for girls, generally report negativity. Boys like being the first one to develop, but can have some negative effects. So we do see some interesting rites of passage. And so as we transition into adolescence, girls will often share their first menstrual cycle with their mother, and sometimes people will celebrate. So the video I have linked in is kind of a goofy commercial that was made by a menstrual supplies company. But, many times girls will get a party or will celebrate this coming of age. It's like a beautiful thing. Boys, we don't really know as much about. They don't seem to really share with other people this spermarche. So some other physical development in adolescence, we do start to see the onset, at least in some teenagers, of eating disorders. So overweight or obesity is, the most common one that we'll see. Have a lot of different negative effects for the teenager. And then we do start to see things like anorexia and bulimia. So we've got those identified there. Anorexia, often self-starvation and exercise. Bulimia is more of a pattern of binge eating and then trying to remove those calories through exercise or laxatives or induced vomiting, things of that nature. People who have anorexia are often more slender. People who have bulimia are often more of an average weight. So there are changes between the two, but a big one is with anorexia, we see a cognitive distortion. So this picture up here has got a woman who's very slender, but she looks in the mirror and she sees herself as a much larger woman. So their distortions, their cognitions are actually distorted. We're seeing a lot of brain growth in our adolescents, and we think this is why adolescents engage in risky behaviors. So that frontal cortex that stops us from doing things, it's kind of like a cognitive brake, that's not fully developed, but the limbic system that's more of a pleasure system and feels the excitement, this is already fully in line. So for teenagers, they feel the excitement of these choices, but they don't really have that cognitive brake. So this is a quote from a researcher. It says, nothing will ever feel as good as it did when you're a teenager. So they're not worse at assessing danger. It's just the rewards of doing these crazy things feel better, and from a brain standpoint really are way greater. So it's not that they don't know that there are risks. Teenagers will know there's a risk to zipping along in a convertible, standing up in the convertible and waving their hands around. They know that's a risk, but it feels much better, and they often think that bad things won't happen to them. Also with brain development or with cognition, we have information processing. This is not really a distinct stage. So these teenagers are largely that, have the working memory speed and things of that as an adult, but there's just tweaking up to those adult levels. And teens also have better content knowledge than adults on different topics. So if you need someone to fix your phone, you probably ask a teenager. If you want to know who Post Malone is or something, ask a teenager. They often have that finger on the pulse or a little bit more content knowledge than adults do in different areas. They're also getting better at knowing what they do and don't know, and a lot better at finding weaknesses in our thinking. So much more analytical, better able to use critical thinking and solve problems. So Piaget said then, once we hit this adolescent stage, that we're in our final stage of development, of cognitive development. So researchers past Piaget think that we do still see change, that we're still developing. But for Piaget, this was it. We were in stage 4, formal operations. We can reason abstractly, so you can think about hard concepts like justice and liberty. We can use deductive reasoning and scientific reasoning. So he was saying, this is it. We're the best that we can be. Yeah, we can't play that one because we are not in class. Why? But the dating game is a different activity. But, I guess you have to think abstractly about which person you would choose, right, if you're on the dating game. Schools and transitions. So with schools, we're transitioning from middle to junior high. So we have a top dog phenomenon. You move from the top position in elementary to the lowest position in middle. So if you are a 5th grader, you're at the top of the school, and you move into 6th grade, and you're at the bottom, and you're tiny, and everyone else is huge, and it can be very scary. High schoolers, you can read that paragraph, though. We want to discourage dropping out. The search for identity. This is another huge aspect of adolescence. Erickson said that this is what our goal of adolescence is, to figure out identity instead of being confused as to our role. So adolescents are going to experiment with different roles, different personalities, and these key changes in identity we're going to talk more about are taking place in emerging adulthood, which we'll get, that's our next chapter. But really, adolescents are trying to figure out, who am I? One of the many ways in which they figure out who they are is through this kind of identity statuses. So this was Marcia's work. And what Marcia said is that we have to experience a crisis and then make a commitment. And this crisis doesn't have to look like a huge crisis. We're not going to fall apart, but we just have to question ourselves and our beliefs and then make a commitment one way or the other. And so they would, he would say, the ideal is to be in this identity achievement. So if we think about something like political orientation, maybe you were raised as a liberal, but you go through this crisis, you try to think, who am I, what am I, and you decide, actually, I'm a libertarian. So then you would have identity achievement. You can still come to the same conclusion. So you can still say, I was raised a liberal, I am a liberal now, or I was raised a conservative, I am a conservative. Totally fine, but it's just the fact that you've thought about it and you've had that crisis. If you've had that crisis but you haven't made a decision, so you're still trying to figure out, who am I, you're in moratorium. If you have not experienced that crisis at all, so if you were raised liberal and you're like, that's where I'm staying, I'm not even going to think about it, Then you've made that commitment with no crisis is foreclosure. If you've had no crisis and no commitment, you're just kind of not even thinking about it. So we've got those definitions there and some examples up high on the slide. Ethnic identity. So this is another part of our identity that we're developing during this time. So it's part that includes a sense of membership in your ethnic group, attitudes and feelings. So we see people generally move through a few steps for ethnic identity. So that their roots are unimportant, then they're going to explore their heritage and want to go and understand more, maybe talk to grandma and grandpa about it, go to festivals, they want to learn who they are, and then finally have a full development of one's own ethnic self-identity. In this slide, we've got some characteristics of the ways that adolescents think. So you can read through this, but adolescent egocentrism is this idea that the world revolves around me. The imaginary audience is an idea that everyone is looking at me. So if I have a pimple, everyone sees it. They're looking at me all the time. The personal fable is that no one understands life the way that I've lived it. I have a unique experience. Nobody understands me. I'm totally different than any other human who's ever lived. And then this illusion of invulnerability is that bad things won't happen to me. So most people when they text and drive, they're going to get in trouble, but not me. So they just have this idea that this won't happen to them. We do have this idea or myth of storm and stress with our adolescents, and so this is an idea that adolescence is just this time of horrible storm or stress and everything's bad, but most adolescents actually feel happy even if their relationships with their parents are changing. Another big thing that adolescents will get into are romantic relationships. So romantic relationships have multiple functions. You develop an identity, companionship. Actually choosing to engage in sex, though, is predicted by parents not monitoring as well, and things like physical maturity. So if we've got that teenager, that boy that we saw on the slide who maybe is 13, but he looks 18, it's going to be more likely to engage in sexual behavior. And we've got a chart there with some information about sexual behavior. We have seen sexual behavior in teens decrease over time. Which is good because there are risks. So sexually transmitted infections are always a risk, and pregnancy is a risk. Oftentimes we see that illusion of invulnerability come in where teens feel like, oh, it won't happen to me, but then obviously it can. And so we want comprehensive sex education for our teenagers. Dating, we have some stages. So first we kind of enter into these affiliations, we then explore, and then 17 to 19 or so, we're consolidating. So we're choosing those couples, kind of learning more about dating and making those relationships. But there's a lot of variation as to when dating will actually begin. Dating in gay and lesbian youth, oftentimes they'll date other sex peers, trying to determine their own sexual orientation or even disguise it from others, and it takes a little bit longer for them often to date than the same sex orientation. Something we can start to see as our teens move into this pattern or into dating world is patterns of dating violence. So I've got some common behaviors exhibited there, as well as this cycle of abuse. So this is something that people can get involved in here. You've got an explosion happen. So you're dating someone, everything seems to be going well, but then they have this explosion of violence, and you're like, where did that come from? Many times after that, they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. I don't know what happened there. I'm just so sorry. But then it can't last. And so when someone is an abuser, that's the best predictor of abusing in the future. They've abused in the past. And so this tension stage is going to build and build and build. They just can't keep it together there, and then there's another explosion. But then it's the same honeymoon period. Oh, I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. Tension builds, explodes. So it's a pattern that we can see. Drug use. So U.S. has one of the highest rates of adolescent drug use. The most common drug is alcohol, but marijuana is very quickly rising. Alcohol and cigarette use has declined in recent years. Marijuana is going to be overtaking that if it hasn't already. It can reduce adolescent drug use by things like teaching coping mechanisms. So if you're really stressed, what are other things you can do other than smoke? And then in school, student-led discussions. So the idea is that we shouldn't have teachers don't smoke pot, kids. But instead we should have a group of kids who are like, I don't smoke pot, I do these other things or whatever. I go to the gym, I hang with my friends. And so it's kind of normalizing other behavior rather than drug use. We can also see teens kind of enter a foray into delinquency. Oftentimes this is more limited to adolescents. So we call that adolescent limited antisocial behavior. So things like stealing scrunchies, from Target or something. This is limited only to adolescents, and they don't continue that behavior. Life course antisocial behavior, they do continue, and it often emerges early. There's a lot of causes, so things like, approval of delinquency in one's culture, parents not being involved, delinquent siblings and peers. So if you've got siblings that are like, yeah, I'm going to go steal from the mini mart, and you're like, let me follow you, brother, I'm going to go steal from the mini mart, then that's what happens there. Depression. So this is something that we start to see with our adolescents, more common in girls, and contributing factor, it does seem to run in families. So it can be genes as well as just how families are modeling how to deal with stress and anxiety. Poor peer relationships, but it can be treated. The important thing is that it is treatable, especially if we start to see it early on in our adolescence. We want to get, some therapeutic help. We can do antidepressants. So there are options. It's not something that one has to suffer with. And it's really important to take those options, to realize this is happening due to suicide and the rates of suicide. So dying by suicide is the third leading cause of death in these young people. So females are more likely to attempt. Males often choose a more lethal means, so they're more likely to actually die by suicide. And there's a lot of risk factors there you can read. But the important thing is to recognize those changes in yourself or in others and to seek help. Peers, for the adolescent, there's nothing more important than one's peers many times. So they're increasingly important, more intense, intimate friendships. So not, likely to have a huge group of friends, but those fewer friends that are the best friends. And peer pressure, which can be good or bad. Good peer pressure is like, hey, let's go to the library and volunteer after school. Bad is like, hey, let's do drugs in the bathroom, so it can be good or bad. We have different terms, so cliques or small groups, so that would be things like, the Mean Girls up there, small group, they do similar activities. Crowds are less personal, so you might be in like the band crowd or the sports crowd, and based on reputation. So sometimes in high schools you can even say like this crowd's the most popular, this crowd's the least popular, things like that. And our final topic for our adolescents is careers. So Super is this person who has theory of career development. So the start of this career development theory is this idea that around 13 we start to see what we have talent in, and then we start to limit our prospects by aging and by learning as we age, and then start implementing some of those ideas. So we might say, hey, I'm really good at Lego, I'm awesome at building things, I might want to be an engineer, I'm going to look into engineering, and then I'm going to go implement and start to learn firsthand from engineering friends. Another theory of career development is Holland's theory. In Holland's theory, the idea is that you would choose a career that fits your talents and skills and interests. You can take little quizzes online to help you see where you'd fall there. But if you're someone who's artistic, then you want to choose something like public health communication specialist. If you're someone who's enterprising, then maybe a public health planner. I don't know why both of those are public health, but all of it must be a public health related thing. But, depending on where you fall, your skill set can help you pick a career is the idea behind that theory. And finally, part-time employment. So for our adolescents, we really don't want them to work more than 15 to 20 hours per week. So work experience has a lot of benefits, but if we're working too much, then this can lead to poor grades. If you're working all the time, you don't have a chance to study, and things like mental health concerns and substance abuse. So you might be out in the workplace with people who are older than you and who drink alcohol, things like that, and they're offering it to you because you're in their workplace, and so it can lead to these issues. So to optimize our health, we really want to work 15 to 20 hours a week or less. And adolescents also can see an earn and burn pattern. So they earn the money, and then many times their needs are met, and so they'll just burn through the money. They're not using it maybe for rent or water bills. They're just using it to go to concerts and movies. And that's not all adolescents, obviously. There's a huge range of what adolescents use money for, but that's a possibility to see an earn and burn pattern. That is the end of our content there for adolescents. That's chapters 11 and 12. I'll see you again for 13 as we move on.